Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this wonderful event tonight, where we have such a great group of people to talk about the Human Rights Act and the opportunity to see it as something real that we will see in future, or potentially still remain a challenge for us as a country to move forward and achieve. My name's Alopila Tukefu. I'm the director for the Edmund Rice Centre. We're a centre for social justice and leadership advocacy in many respects, advocacy leadership, I should say. And our work has traditionally covered the areas of First Nations in Australia's rights and self-determinations, refugee and people seeking asylum's rights, as well as the issue of the Pacific and climate justice and climate change, alongside the broader issues around human rights. I would like to take the opportunity now to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're coming to you from, the Wangal and Gadigal people of the Eora and Darug nations here in Sydney, and we acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. And we acknowledge also the challenge that we all face as a country, given the outcome of the referendum last year. And we hope that the future will be a bit brighter in terms of finding a pathway forward to find reconciliation and an opportunity to move forward with the Uluru Statement of the Heart and its intent, and also to recognise our Indigenous people and our First Peoples' rights in Australia under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, of which Australia is a signatory. We have a panel today of amazing people. I'm going to introduce Olivia first and then let her take the reins from here. Olivia Chollet is an Anne Kantor Fellow with the Australia Institute. She's a researcher with an international background and a keen interest for gender and socio-environmental issues in the Asia Pacific. She holds a BA in International Relations, the University of Geneva, a MA in Pacific and Asian Studies from SOAS University of London, and has a graduate certificate in Public Policy from the Australian National University, which I share a master's in as well. I just realised that we have studied in the same august institution. She's also an improv coach and has experience working as a teacher and in the cultural and non-profit sector. And we were very, very lucky to have someone as talented and as brilliant as Olivia with us for the time that we did to do some of the work on this really important area. And if you haven't had the chance, please go on our website, because you can download the paper that was worked on that allows you to see. So it's erc.org.au, and you'll see the paper that Olivia worked on. That is a sort of companion piece to this event. One of the things I'd ask everyone to do is just to keep themselves muted for the extent of this event, and then we'll be opening it up for questions. But if you can type your questions on the chat, if possible, unless you find that difficult, and please, if that is the case, please raise your hand and we'll try and bring you in via the video. But we will try and do everything via Corinne, who's sitting ready to look at all of the questions coming through and pass on to Olivia and the rest of the team to answer and have the Q&A session. So without further ado, Olivia, over to you.
Thank you, LOP. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So after the US elections, it seems like an especially appropriate time to talk about the importance of human rights. When it comes to human rights, Australia is a party to 7 United Nations human rights treaties, but it is the only Western democracy without a domestic human rights act or a Bill of Rights. So why? Why doesn't Australia have a human rights act? Why do we need one? And most importantly, how can we make one happen? So to discuss these issues today, I'm joined by David Shoebridge, Greens Senator for New South Wales and Australian Greens spokesperson on justice, digital rights, defence and veterans, and migration. He is a member of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights And before he joined the Senate, he was an MP in the New South Wales Parliament and the chair of the Public Accountability Committee, where he also campaigned for a Bill of Rights in New South Wales. Thanks for joining us, David. Our second guest is Madeleine Howle. Madeleine is a lawyer in the Human Rights Law Centre. And like me, she is a 2024 Anne Kantor Fellow with the Australia Institute. Madeleine works in the Democratic Freedoms team of the Human Rights Law Centre in the Whistleblower Project, providing support and advice to whistleblowers to speak up about wrongdoing in the public interest and hold government and the private sector to account. Madeleine is passionate about the need for a Human Rights Act to provide the framework for the Australian community to challenge injustice and foster a culture of respect for human rights. So I'll begin by giving a little bit of context about human rights in Australia. There's a long history of advocacy for human rights in the country. In 2009, a Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights was established, of which you're now a member, David. And just a few months ago, it released a report calling for a Human Rights Act, highlighting the need for more effective protections. The proposed act is modeled after recommendations from the Australian Human Rights Commission. It would cover federal laws and federal authorities in protecting the rights of everyone in Australia, both citizens and non-citizens. Human rights, and especially the question of a Human Rights Act, can seem like a bit of a technical legal issue, or it can also be perceived as an issue that's more relevant to non-democratic countries. So to start us off, I'd like to ask each of you, David and Madeleine, to define what human rights are, and how human rights are relevant, even in a democracy like Australia. Madeleine, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thanks, Olivia. I'd also just firstly like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and also just acknowledge the role that the law has played in the ongoing dispossession of First Nations cultures and peoples, and pay my respects. So the history, I guess, behind the human rights norms that we now accept come from a very Western European post-war kind of period. But we're talking about the rights that were first recognised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they've manifested in those various different international human rights treaties and instruments that Olivia mentioned earlier, that Australia is a signatory to the majority of. So we're talking about civil and political rights like the right to protest, the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of expression. And we're talking about economic, cultural and social rights like the right to education, the right to health, and the right to not be discriminated against. And so these are sort of these generally universal agreed upon principles that apply to every single person by virtue of their humanity. No matter who we are, where we live, we all deserve to have our human rights protected and respected. And currently, some of these rights are reflected in our domestic laws, but they're not all in one place, and they're not comprehensive enough. I'll pass on it to Senator Shoebridge there.
Well, I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad Madeleine did all the heavy lifting for me. So thanks, Madeleine. Yeah, what Madeleine said. Look, I want to start by acknowledging I'm coming to you all from the Parliament House on Ngambri and Ngunnawal land, and pay my respects to First Nations peoples across this country, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Yeah, so human rights are those fundamental elements that allow us to live our lives with dignity and respect, basically. And you know, there are thankfully they are a developing concept as countries become wealthier. The ways we can interact change over time with things like technology or cultural changes. They're not a static set of principles that are established after World War II or established after a particular revolution or a particular moment in politics. They are genuinely dynamic, and I don't think they're culturally neutral either. But for me, they are this package of rights that allow you to live your life with respect and decency, and increasingly, I think the rights that we fundamentally need to protect are rights to things like housing, rights to clean water, rights to a future, a sustainable future, and rights to an environment that is self-sustaining and that allows us to live on a planet which is biodiverse and rich and will sustain us going forward. So yes, there are those narrow class of political rights, not to be arbitrarily detained, the right to a fair trial. There's those political rights, but increasingly, I think people see it as this package of rights that allows you to live that life of respect and dignity.
Well, thank you both. And David, I'd like later to come back to the right to a healthy environment and ask you to unpack this a little. Before that, Madeleine, I'd like to ask you as a lawyer, could you maybe run us through how the human rights protection framework works in Australia in plain terms, and maybe explain how it, what the gaps are in this framework?
Yeah, so currently Australia has a really long history of turning up to international human rights meetings and pledging to sign up to these treaties and signing up to these human rights treaties, and then coming home and not necessarily implementing them all in Australia. So whilst we've signed up to a lot of these international treaties, the way that our federalist legal system works is that they're not immediately enforceable in Australia for individuals. Some of these rights we do have, so we've got quite a number of different anti-discrimination laws at the federal level that protect people's right not to be discriminated against based on certain protected attributes. And if those rights are breached by a federal law, then you have a right of action to take to the Australian Human Rights Commission to try and seek some kind of compensation or some kind of reparation for the breach of that right. So we do have that system currently, but the fact that we don't have a unified Human Rights Act means that not all of these rights that we're talking about are actually protected at the federal level currently. So that limits the ability of individual people to enforce these rights that we're talking about.
Right. Thank you. Turning to David, I think there's quite a long history of advocacy for Human Rights Act in Australia, and you were part of it. The 2009 National Human Rights Consultation already recommended enacting a Human Rights Act. So how do you explain that it has not happened yet?
The only reason we don't have a comprehensive human rights framework in Australia is because of power and self-interest. And overwhelmingly, when Australians are asked, they fundamentally want a set of human rights. Many of them assume that we already have a set of human rights, and they can start naming amendments to our constitution that never happened because they've soaked up so much United States culture. They assume we have a bunch of rights, but at a federal level, there are, apart from some hodgepodge of statutory anti-discrimination provisions, there are no federal human rights. There's no federal human rights act in my home state of New South Wales. There's no Human Rights Act in New South Wales, and so two reasons why that hasn't happened. Giving people rights, say if you gave First Nations peoples rights over their culture and their land and their water, that would interfere with the mining industry. And the mining industry have been vociferous against giving First Nations peoples those kinds of rights. If you give individuals the rights to challenge the excess police powers or other excesses by the executive government, then you interfere with politicians and their power over you. And at both the New South Wales level and a federal level, politicians have been very anxious about handing over any rights to individuals, which can be enforced in another part of our constitutional makeup in the form of the courts. They don't want to give the courts any power to enforce human rights for individuals that are contrary to what the government of the day wants to gift them. So, it's power, economic power, political power, and self-interest that has prevented giving what the overwhelming majority of Australians want, which is some enforceable human rights.
Yeah, in the course of the research that we did, Amnesty International did some polling about human rights in Australia, and out of two people thought that Australia already has some kind of Human Rights Act. And when told that actually Australia doesn't have a Human Rights Act, 3 out of 4 people say they would support one. That's before it becomes a politicized question, of course, but that's pretty telling. And going into this question, people assume they have rights because Australia's democracy generally works pretty well, but these rights are in practice not necessarily very well protected. So it's really important, I guess, to also work on the public awareness and public support for human rights. Madeleine, you work at the Human Rights Law Centre, and the Human Rights Law Centre is coordinating a national campaign for a Human Rights Act. So far, more than 100 organizations have joined this campaign. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how it works and what the strategy is?
Yeah, so if you go to that link, you'll see that the campaign is a coalition of now 112 civil society organisations dedicated to see a federal Human Rights Act in Australia. So, and dedicated to pushing the Australian government to create a Human Rights Act, but also educating the community about what that actually means. So as you were touching on there before, Olivia, a really big kind of challenge is making sure that the community actually understands what their human rights would be under Human Rights Act and how that would benefit everybody in the community. So there's still a really long way to go, and mobilising civil society and the community to really push the government to enact a Human Rights Act is crucial. This is an essential reform that the majority of our community do support, but it's not going to happen by itself. So whilst there are now over 100 organisations signed up, we know that this, of course, does not fully reflect the full breadth and depth of our community and of civil society organisations that exist. And we really want to see more organisations signing up to the campaign. You can find out more on that website, and there's information on how to sign up there as well, or just email us if you want to sign your organisation up.
Thank you. Another question I had, one really good thing about that campaign is that it looked into the states that do have Human Rights Act at the state and territory level. So that's the case in the ACT. 20 years ago, the ACT Human Rights Act was passed, and I can see that we have Helen Watchirs online. Thank you for joining us. Helen was the Human Rights Commissioner in the ACT for a very long time, and she's been very helpful with this research. So thank you, Helen, for joining. We also have Human Rights Act in Victoria and Queensland. So the Human Rights Law Centre's campaign has taken 101 cases, I believe, from these states to see how it actually helps, it benefits everyone in the community. So it's a whole range of cases. Maybe Madeleine, could you maybe tell us about one or two of these cases and, to show us how it applies in practice?
Sure. Yeah, the 101 cases on the Human Rights Act website is really, really useful for seeing how state and territory Human Rights Act have really benefited the community, because we do now have 3 state and territories that have Human Rights Act. This isn't sort of a new concept. So I think a good example in Queensland is there was a case where Tenants Queensland, which is a civil society organisation, used the Queensland Human Rights Act to help a single mother who had experienced domestic violence to avoid eviction. So the tenant's housing provider had sought to terminate her lease for serious breaches caused by her ex-partner, who had refused to leave the premises. And Tenants Queensland assisted the mother to draft a letter, a letter of complaint under the Human Rights Act and submissions in response to the application of termination, putting to the landlord that was, and the tribunal, that was against the Human Rights Act. And the tribunal granted an adjournment, which allowed the parties to then negotiate a transfer of the tenancy. and the housing provider then ultimately withdrew the application for termination. So that's a really good example of the right to housing in action, and an experience that unfortunately a lot of women experience in Australia. Under the Victorian Charter of Human Rights, there was an example of where a woman was denied immediate medical assistance in relation to treating a medical condition in her hand due to her being over the age of 50. And she'd been waiting 3 years for treatment, and the failure to access treatment in the near future could have led to the need to amputate her hand. Her advocate used the charter to argue for her access to treatment, and she ultimately received funding in order to arrange for her immediate treatment. And I think that's a good example of where the right to health was raised under the Victorian Charter to advocate for a good outcome outside of having to file in court. That wasn't a litigious process. That's a good example of where the Human Rights Act isn't just about litigation. It's about being able to use the human rights that are in the law to say to the department, or whether it's government or whoever, you're doing this wrong, this is against this law. And I'll let everybody explore the other 99 wonderful examples.
Yeah, it's a really well-made campaign, so do check it out, and hopefully we'll have some time in a bit to talk about the right to a healthy environment that, as I mentioned, was just added to the ACT Human Rights Act. I'd like to turn to David and maybe talk a bit more about politics. So for people who are not that familiar with how Parliament works and how legislation gets made, how would it happen in practice? How would a Human Rights Act be passed? What would be the required steps?
So we're talking about a piece of legislation that could pass through the Commonwealth Parliament and become law. There's a different process to change the Constitution. We've just had an experience in that, and it turns out that's quite tricky. But we're talking about a legislation that would enact a statutory human rights Act, and the Commonwealth, if it made a law like that, could say that any law that was contrary to the Human Rights Act should be sort of read down or not effective to the extent that it is contradicted by a Human Rights Act. So it can effectively overpower other acts that are inconsistent with it. But how do you get one? Well, you need to persuade more than 50% of senators, and the chamber I live in, and 50% of members in the House of Representatives to vote for one. Now, it can be introduced, any member of Parliament in either house can introduce a human rights bill, and it can then, if it's introduced in the Senate and passed by a majority in the Senate, it then goes to the other house, the House of Representatives, and then if it gets passed by a majority of those, it then goes off to the Governor-General, should go off to a president, goes off to a Governor-General who signs it, and it becomes law. That's how a law passes. But it doesn't have to be a government bill. It can come from the opposition. It can come from the crossbench. And I think one of the really interesting prospects after we get the next federal election will be if neither of the Labor Party or the coalition has an absolute majority as they don't in the House of Representatives, and we have a minority government, there is a really terrific opportunity, I think, for what's called the crossbench, a growing part of both of those chambers that belongs to either independents or parties like the Greens. There's a real prospect for the crossbench to introduce a human rights bill in one or both houses, and then use the fact that neither of the other parties have a majority to say, well, actually, you want to deal with us? You need us to get a whole bunch of other legislation for you. This is really important to us. So I think the next Parliament will be fascinating, but at the end of the day, it needs a majority in both houses, and then it can become law.
And what has been the reception of the Parliamentary Joint Committee report so far in Parliament?
Well, I mean, often before a piece of legislation becomes law and gets voted on in the chambers, it traditionally gets referred off to a Senate inquiry, and the Senate has, a well-established tradition of getting a committee. They often specialise in a particular, part of legislation. So I'm, for example, on the Legal and Constitutional Committee, and I'm also on the Parliamentary Joint Committee that oversights human rights. And those committees can review a piece of legislation, take submissions from the public, and see if the public or other key stakeholders would like the legislation changed or amended or extended, or maybe, popped in the shredder. And hopefully the system is meant to work by taking the best ideas from all of those submissions and then incorporating them into recommendations about how to change the legislation, which then the Parliament adopts. They amend the legislation and then pass through improved legislation. That's how it's meant to work. Often, though, of course, those committees can be controlled by the government of the day, or politics can get in the way of, a fair assessment of the submissions. So the likely outcome, we had an inquiry that ran for a substantial amount of time in front of the Parliamentary Joint Committee, and that actually has both senators and members from the other house, the House of Representatives, on it. It has a government chair and a government majority. So I was always a bit anxious about how that would consider a human rights bill. But thankfully, that Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights said we should have a Commonwealth human rights bill, and it should contain a bunch of really important human rights. And the next Parliament, after the next election, should just bloody well get on with the job and pass a human rights bill. There are a number of MPs, from across the different political parties who I hope are committed to that. You've got a majority, as I said, on the Parliamentary Joint Committee. It hasn't been, massively endorsed by the coalition, I think it would be fair to say. There's some tepid support from Labor, and I think we should all be trying to, put pressure on Labor to commit to it in the upcoming federal election. My party has a long-standing position of, very strongly supporting voting for human rights and establishing a human rights bill. And I know there's a number of independents who also support it. So I'm very hopeful, but I think there's probably a greater likelihood of us getting one in a minority government in the next Parliament.
Mm-hmm. This lines up with what I've heard from different people in the course of the research, expressing that same hope that we have a lot of the fundamentals in place to actually have it passed. There is growing support. People start to realize that actually human rights are relevant here. There has been issues like robo-debt scandals, the COVID-19 policies. All of that, I think, contributes to making it possible. And likely under the next term. Madeleine, I'd like to ask you briefly about the Edmund Rice Centre also does a lot of work on First Nations people and other minorities. I'd like to ask you a little bit how a Human Rights Act would improve justice for these groups.
Sure. I think first, just to say, the Human Rights Law Centre supports First Nations self-determination. But to the extent that the Australian government can and does exercise its power to make laws and policies with respect to First Nations communities, the Human Rights Act would present a tool to ensure or to help ensure that those laws and policies don't breach the human rights of First Nations peoples. So, as we know, the ongoing process of colonisation in Australia continues to perpetuate injustices against First Nations peoples. And that means that often the decisions of government are disproportionately impacting their communities. And the Human Rights Act is a tool to allow First Nations communities, as well as all communities, to advocate and hold the government to account when those decisions are made. So I think it's important sort of not to frame the Human Rights Act as something that's only going to impact particular communities or only going to impact marginalised communities. But we have seen examples where First Nations communities in Australia have had to go to international human rights bodies, like the United Nations Human Rights Committee, to have gross human rights abuses considered. And those decisions are then rarely translated into domestic policy here in Australia. So, for an example, governments need to be held accountable for policies that result in over-incarceration of First Nations children, And the Human Rights Act would make any decision by governments that violate the right of First Nations people to equality before the law to be justiciable domestically, and also implore that the government considers that human right and others in their policy making. So that's really what it's about broadly for all communities, but particularly First Nations communities are one community in Australia that have experienced human rights abuses, particularly by government.
Thank you. We'll go to questions really soon. One last thing I wanted to ask David is as promised, I'd like to go back to the right to a healthy environment that was recently added to the ACT Human Rights Act. So as we mentioned, it's also really important to, when advocating for a Human Rights Act, to emphasize how it would benefit everyone and not just a few groups. And maybe the right to a healthy environment is one of those rights that really apply to everyone. So David, maybe could you explain what the links are between climate, between the environment and human rights, and how it would maybe make a difference for climate action to have a Human Rights Act?
Well, we know that the communities that will be hardest hit and are already facing the impacts of climate change are the communities with the least economic and cultural and political resources. We see that in the Pacific region. It's Pacific countries with the least resources who are facing an existential threat from climate change. And they're saying to powerful countries like Australia, we'd like you to keep coal and gas in the ground, please, if you want to be our friend. We know that in my home city of Sydney, people in Western Sydney, for example, are facing the clearest and most present health risk from climate change, with increasing numbers of extreme heat days in Western Sydney, where sometimes the air can just be trapped and circulated for days, and it's extreme heat that is one of perhaps the most common cause of environmentally related deaths and premature deaths in Western Sydney. And that's largely from people who can't afford to pay to keep their air conditioner going, or they don't have an air conditioner, or they live in accommodation that has zero insulation, and therefore are the most at risk. So you can already see how climate change is impacting the most vulnerable in our society. And if people had a right to a safe environment, if they had a right to approach a court to compel governments to stop doing action that threatens their safe environment, those people with the least actually get the most out of having a Human Rights Act. I think we should also acknowledge this is one of the reasons why it's very hard to get a Human Rights Act, a modern Human Rights Act, through the Commonwealth Parliament. You know, we have a government that has approved, I don't know, last time I looked, more than 20 coal and gas projects in this term of government. We have an opposition that would have wished them to have approved 50. And we have very cashed up special interests who want to ensure that people don't have those kind of rights to stop mining corporations and the fossil fuel industry in particular. But can I just give you one note of hope about how human rights can really change things and change our perception? I commenced my contribution by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and this is credit to Helen and those people who have worked for a human rights bill in the ACT. The reason I say Ngunnawal and Ngambri is because the Ngambri people brought an application under the ACT Human Rights Act and said they were not being respected, they were not being heard, their traditional connection to this country was not being acknowledged by the ACT government. And under the human rights framework, they managed to negotiate an outcome with the ACT government so that their connection to this country is respected. So, a very clear case of how people who have been suffering ongoing disrespect can use a Human Rights Act to progress their interests.
Yeah, and in Queensland as well recently, under the Human Rights Act, the court had to consider whether opening a new coal mine was going to affect people in future generations. And that's something they had to take into account to actually, I'm not sure about the exact details, but they had to take it into consideration to actually make a decision and refuse this mine to go ahead. So it can make a difference.
With an example, a clear example. And, you know, imagine if people had a right to bring applications for clean water to ensure their water is clean and not polluted by mining upstream. Or people in Newcastle had a right to clean air, which meant that they could prevent millions and millions of tons of coal and coal dust being driven through their city. You can see how those rights impact quite exploitative industries, but you can also see how empowering they are for people.
For sure. Thank you both. I think we will now turn to questions from the audience, if we have any. Corinne?
Yes. Thanks, Olivia. We've got a question from Carmel Hansen about shelter. If shelter is a human right, then where does this leave the state and federal governments with regards to homelessness? If we did have, well, how does it work at the state level, first of all, especially if the state has a Human Rights Act, and how would it work at federal level?
Thank you, Corinne. Would any of you like to take up this question?
Well, I mean, in my home state of New South Wales, there's no state human rights provisions, and in the Commonwealth, there's no human rights provisions. How would a right to shelter work? Well, it's considered, you know, one of those fundamental rights, one of the things you need in order to sustain your existence, the right to shelter and food and health. You know, these are fundamental rights. What it could do is it could, if there was a Commonwealth right to shelter, it could allow somebody to approach the Commonwealth government department and say, I'm homeless, I have nowhere to live, my kids have nowhere to live, I'd like you to provide me with adequate shelter. And if they refuse to provide them with adequate shelter, they could bring an action to compel the government to either, you know, assist them in obtaining rental accommodation, or hopefully force the government to change its spending priorities so that they build adequate public and community housing. How that would play out in practice would depend upon the facts and circumstances of the case, would depend upon the kind of powers that a court was given under a Human Rights Act. But I mean, how powerful would that be if an individual who was living in their car with their kids could actually have an enforceable right to make the Commonwealth government provide them with shelter? That would be an incredibly positive outcome. But some states have some limited rights to shelter, and Madeleine might be able to help with that.
Just to say, I think that's a wonderful answer, Senator Shoebridge. I think it's important to remember that the Human Rights Act, just like any law, isn't going to be a silver bullet. But it is about instilling these laws, not just not just creating the right to take action, but also instilling these laws in our culture. And there's this argument that we hear a lot about. It's sort of like potentially creating a floodgate of litigation or something like that, where everybody's trying to litigate all these rights. I just don't. That's just not really a reality. But I think, there's so many examples like shelter where this is something that a lot of people in Australia are facing due to the cost of living crisis, which is as a result of the fact that our government is making policy decisions that aren't underpinned by human rights. So it's about starting to instill that human rights culture and foundation in the way that decision making and policy making happens.
Okay, I've got a question, a point of clarification, a question to clarify what rights would actually be included in a Human Rights Act exactly, and who dictates or who decides which rights are to be protected? What's that based on?
That's a really good question. I think from my understanding, the Human Rights Act that we have at the state and territory levels have been modeled after the Human Rights Act that they have in the UK. And they're constantly evolving. So in the case of the Human Rights Act in the ACT, it's also been improved over time. So it can be improved in incremental ways. We don't have to start with all the rights, and often, if I understand correctly, we would start with the civil and the rights that we have under international treaties. Maybe Madeleine or David, if you'd like to complete my answer.
Yes, if you look at the Parliamentary Joint Committee report, there is a model or an example Human Rights Act, which does build or sort of, corroborate and build on the State and Territory Human Rights Act that already exist, and potentially makes them better as well. And where do those Human Rights Acts come from? Human rights come from. They come from all of those treaty instruments that we were talking about before, and ultimately from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Who dictates what rights are to be protected? It is a tricky question, because there are human rights that are sometimes at odds with each other, and no, there are some human rights that are non-derogable, but which means that they, like the right to not be tortured or the right to life, we agree as a society that those are absolute. But most other rights, we agree generally that there are some measures on those. So, for instance, the right to freedom of expression shouldn't be interpreted to allow hate speech. So it's really about how we as a society accept and measure those human rights against each other. And that's something that will continue to evolve. It's not static. But just to emphasise, at the moment, we do not have a Federal Human Rights Act. So the first step is to get a Human Rights Act and get commitment to a Human Rights Act, and then we'll get into drafting it.
Yeah, Madeleine?
I think that's a really good answer. And David, you just alluded before when we started that rights are not always culturally neutral as well. So I think it really ties into the fact that as a society, we need to have this rights-minded culture and to have a sense of what human rights mean, what they can mean, what we want them to mean. At the moment, it's just a vague sense that we have some protections, but we're not quite sure which they are and which they should be.
We'd like
if you wanted to add anything, yeah.
We'd like it to move beyond the vibe to an actual right. That would be good. And I think Madeleine sort of pointed out that the different states and territories. The ACT, I think, was the one who kicked it off, and credit to the ACT. And over time, those additional rights and remedies have been attached. But the ACT isn't just when there's a breach, you get to whack the government. The ACT's model is to kind of create a dialogue model and to hopefully change the behaviour of government so that it becomes a body that respects rights, and then also change the behaviour of other significant players in the ACT so that they become respectful of rights. And rather than have it all based upon people bringing cases to remedy when rights have been breached, a really well-designed Human Rights Act makes us a kind of, as you say, a society that is literate about human rights, that's respectful of human rights, and builds it into our daily our daily conduct and the bread and butter, for example, of the work of Parliament. There is a provision in the Commonwealth Parliament that says, legislation has to be considered against a bunch of human rights outcomes, but that is, I've got to say, I read those analyses that attach to a bunch of legislation here. They're always drafted by the government of the day. They always find, no matter what the government is doing, that is always consistent with human rights. It doesn't matter how tortured the argument is. And those kinds of things can become a kind of rote, unhelpful practice. Why a Human Rights Act becomes really powerful is because if the government is just going through the form of pretending that what they're doing is compliant with the human rights, somebody can give them a whack and correct their behaviour and put them back on course.
Yeah.
The questions are really starting to flow now. So I've got a very specific question for you, David, from Ashish. How often does the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights meet? What's your timeline? Ashish checked 4 days back, and the committee was supposed to meet this week, and now he sees it's been postponed to the 20th of November. Can you provide a little bit of clarification on that point, David?
I can. Well, it meets most weeks when Parliament's sitting. I've only been put on it in the last 6 months. It was a bit of an arm wrestle with the government to get to have a Greens representative on it, and I'm hoping that's a good outcome, that we now have a Greens rep on the committee. It meets most weeks, and it has a bunch of referred work that it does. The Attorney General can actually refer inquiries to the Human Rights Committee. It can request the houses to refer work to it, or the houses themselves. Both houses can refer inquiries down to the Human Rights Committee. But it doesn't just have a kind of, we don't just meet and have as one of our agenda items how to fix human rights in Australia. I mean, that would kind of be nice, but that isn't how it works. It tends to work on business that's been referred to it by either the Attorney General or both houses. And so having completed that work on the Human Rights report, delivered its recommendations that the next Parliament should get on with the job and introduce a Human Rights Act that sort of builds on what the states and territories have done, we don't then meet and keep discussing that each weekly meeting. It would have to have a fresh referral in the next Parliament, say, for us to recommence that work.
Thanks, David. I have a very interesting question from Tenzin Norzin, who is a refugee from Tibet. And Tenzin asks, a lot of Australian citizens and refugees in exile face a lot of transnational repression due to affiliated political activities. Would the Human Rights Act protect these individuals? And if not, then can anything be done to address transnational repression?
Madeleine, would you like to tackle this?
It's a big question. I think maybe the first point in that is that the Human Rights Act or the Human Rights Act that's been proposed would apply to people who might have various different types of visa status in Australia within Australian territory. Around sort of how it applies transnationally, I think that's probably a question that falls a little bit partly outside the scope of a Human Rights Act. And, at the international human rights level, we see a lot of discussion about how like international violations of human rights are dealt with. I don't know do you have anything to add to that, Senator?
Well, yeah, I agree, Madeleine, but I have quite a number of people come and approach me because of transnational repression, Tenzin. So, and I know that it is something that parts of the Tibetan diaspora in the country feel. I also know that there are some, it is happening to parts of the Pakistan diaspora, to some communities from India as well. But it's not limited to those countries. I know that the Iranian community has been deeply concerned about being observed and targeted. The Kurdish community, a variety of communities really get a sense that they need protection when they're living in Australia. So, a Human Rights Act, if somebody had been able to prove that they were facing transnational repression, and if there were perhaps agents of a foreign country in this country seeking to threaten them, threaten their safety, potentially, threaten their bodily integrity, then potentially a Human Rights Act would allow somebody to request protection and assistance from government agencies to provide a level of protection for them. It becomes difficult when courts or say a Human Rights Commission is directing the police or ASIO or those kinds of government agencies. There would be questions about, the extent to which a a court or a human rights commission could direct a body like the police or ASIO or others to protect people, but it would it'd be at least some kind of enforceable right that people could use. And I think the question of transnational repression is a growing problem in our society, and the Human Rights Act might just be a small way of helping to address that. Of course, a Human Rights Act might also be useful if the government wanted to deport somebody. And I'll tell you, I'm just looking at some fresh legislation the government has just introduced that is designed to give them additional powers to detain and deport people under the Migration Act. A Human Rights Act might be a way of people bringing an application under the Human Rights Act and say they have a right to be free from torture. They have a right to life, and they could use that potentially Human Rights Act to prevent their return to a country which may torture or kill them as well.
Thanks, David.
I think we had a comment in the chat that I cannot currently read from Helen Watchirs about the ACT human rights on that. Can we?
Just came through. Helen says ACT Human Rights Commission has a collection of 20 case summaries published last year. And Helen gives a link inside the chat, hrc.act.gov.au, if you want to check out these case summaries. Did you want to quickly say something, Helen, to accompany your comment?
Yeah, sure. It was just a practical example of the Act's now 20 years old, so we did a summary of significant cases. A good example is the case of Davidson, where a man was in the part of the prison that had his rights restricted, and the judge made a decision saying whether you're Nelson Mandela or anyone at all in that prison, your rights are the same. You have a right to exercise and go outside for an hour every day. You can't be kept in a tiny cell with a little exercise yard out the back. You need to have full access to your rights for humane treatment. So there's 20 of those cases there for people to see what human rights looks like in practice.
Beautiful. Thanks, Helen. We've got another question around the impact that a Federal Human Rights Act would have on existing bills that may not comply with basic human rights in some cases.
I'll start quickly and then I'll throw it to Madeleine or Olivia. It really does depend how it's drafted. I mean, a powerful Human Rights Act would say, these are your rights. And they're not absolute, as Madeleine pointed out. Sometimes your rights are in competition to each other. A right to free speech, as well as a right to not be the subject of harassment and vilification. Those rights can be in conflict with each other. But if the legislation said that this Human Rights Act will override other acts to the extent that they're in conflict, that can be a really powerful way of effectively cleaning up, a century and a bit of legislation that has been passed without regard to human rights. And I think Olivia referenced the case in Queensland where that was really a planning decision, a planning approval about a coal mine, and those who were opposed to the coal mine were able to rely upon the provisions in the Human Rights Act to say, well, look, these provisions in the Human Rights Act are relevant to how you interpret this planning legislation, and you should, include the rights to a safe environment when you're considering the planning legislation, and that was actually quite powerful in that case. So, a powerful Human Rights Act would, first of all, apply to legislation that's been passed before it, and would also say that any, current or future legislation should be read to be consistent with the Human Rights Act to the extent that they are in conflict.
Thank you, David and Madeleine. Corinne, I'm not sure how many questions we had left, but we are running out of time soon.
This one I think will be fairly quick to answer. It's a question from Alopi, and I think it's an interesting one. The Northern Territory intervention and suspension of Racial Discrimination Act at the time was a big issue for those communities affected by this decision. Would a Federal Human Rights Act avoid that from happening again?
I can start on that one. I think it's a classic lawyer's answer that it depends. And it does depend on how the Human Rights Act, when it is written, whether it can be sort of worked around by government. That's been one of the big things that I think has made people really sceptical, particularly, in Queensland. It's been really disappointing to see how the government has kind of been able to work around or derogate from the Human Rights Act, particularly when it comes to really aggressive approaches to youth crime. But I think it does come back to the fact that the reason why that intervention and that legislation was able to be passed so easily is because the government didn't have an obligation to measure that against human rights. So it's a start, and I hope so. I hope that a Human Rights Act would prevent that from happening again.
Yeah, don't just pass legislation and then hope the politicians will be good forevermore. You've got to have a Human Rights Act, and then you've got to keep fighting for it. And a good example would be Queensland as well. They have a Human Rights Act that actually is meant to protect children in detention. And last year, to their shame, the Queensland government passed some legislation that allowed children to be detained in adult detention centres and have indefinite detention of children in adult detention centres, contrary to the Human Rights Act. And in the legislation that was passed that was harming children's rights, they deliberately and intentionally suspended that part of the Human Rights Act that would have prevented that bad legislation passing. So let's get a Human Rights Act, and then let's make sure we hold politicians to account going forward.
Olivia, one last question from you.
Yeah, it's a quick question. I think, what can we do? What can listeners do? What would be your advice to make this move forward? How can we help in one sentence each?
Sign your organisation up to the Human Rights Act campaign.
That was an easy one. Yeah.
And talk to your friends, your family, and your community about human rights and why it matters for everybody in the community.
Yeah, do more of what the Edmund Rice Centre and the Human Rights Law Centre have done tonight. And I want to commend both organisations for the work of talking about rights and getting the community to be literate so that they know what the rights are. And they know that we don't have a bunch of rights, and we should actually expect our politicians to deliver them. And I'm going to be really brutally political. We're going to have a federal election sometime between now and the middle of next year. And say to whoever wants your vote, will you support in the next Parliament a Human Rights Act? And if you won't, well, perhaps I won't vote for you. And look for, hopefully we get a majority of politicians elected in the next Parliament who will actually use this, I hope, rare opportunity, hopefully an opportunity then that changes the way we do politics going forward, but use this next Parliament to do what we've been waiting decades and decades for. And if they won't, don't vote for them.
Yeah, I think given what happened last night in the US, we have to be brutally political, as you said, David. Now is the time to be political and to talk about it, because we actually have a chance to make this better and to make politicians act on it. So thank you so much for your time. I'll let Corinne wrap up the webinar, but it was a pleasure to talk to you both.
Thanks, Olivia. I just want to quickly say a big thank you to our panelists. David, we thank you for your work in Parliament over many, many years. I think you're the hardest working MP I've ever met, and I've met a lot of them. So thank you very much.
Well,
Madeleine,
thank you for giving me an hour off Senate estimates. This is so much nicer and more positive. I'm really grateful.
And Madeleine and Olivia are both Kantor Fellows with the Australian Institute. So I want to thank the Australia Institute for attracting such great talent and lending us Olivia at the Edmund Rice Centre for a couple of weeks. Olivia, you have a wonderful inquiring mind, and your intelligence and commitment is much appreciated. And I think everyone will agree. And I'm already getting comments that this webinar was incredibly interesting. I think one of the challenges that we face in legislating a Human Rights Act is that it's quite technical. And these are very hard, technical issues to engage the public in. Thank you to everyone who attended today. And if you did attend, I'm hopeful that you will get involved in the campaign and spread the word to people around you. Have a good evening, everybody. This webinar has been recorded, so the recording will be emailed within the next couple of weeks. Thank you again and good night.